Good morning. Welcome to the 1619 Project. My name is Antonio Ruiz. My co-host is Thomas Fields.
Morning.
We're going to probably over a number of months have a conversation about this book, the 1619 Project. A fascinating book. For some people, controversial. I don't think it's controversial. It's American history. It's the American history that a lot of Americans don't want to talk about. Thomas, why don't you start with why you think we should be doing this? What do you want to get out of this? What do you want to give to this?
I thought it was brilliant that this book came out in 2019, which is the 400th anniversary of 1619, which was, of course, the landing in Jamestown of the first 20 slaves. So for me, it's a recognition of that time period. And more importantly, it's to widen and deepen my understanding of what took place in this country and this family. As we all have been indoctrinated with the concept of America being the land of the free. And I mean, we know that slavery existed and was not true for everybody. It was certainly not true for women. It's certainly not true for non-property owning white people. And obviously wasn't true for those who were deemed 3/5. But that mythology has taken such root that it becomes, part of our psyche. And to me, the 1619 Project helped bring truth to it, but to break that chain, break that cycle. So that's where I'm at. I want to learn more about the true meaning of what this country gave birth to.
I've told the story a million times, but I'll say it again. Back when I was about 17 and living in the Bronx and going to James Monroe High School. And so we're talking, 1965, somewhere in there. So we're in the middle of the civil rights movement. And I'm sitting in the cafeteria and engaged in an argument with some white students, the liberal white students, about why I really think that we really need to deal with racism in this country and the civil rights movement, blah blah blah. And someone turned to me and says, "But you're not Black." And first I got like, well, because I didn't know how to respond to that. And I say all of this because, I'm half Puerto Rican, half Dominican. We can have a long discussion about the Dominican part of me. Anybody who knows about Hispaniola, the island, which the Dominican Republic shares with Haiti, the slaves that came through there. And I thought a lot about that. And yes, I am not Black in African-American sense of the word. But you don't have to be quote unquote Black American to know what the history of this country is, to protest for social justice. And I think that's where sometimes the discussion gets muddled, is that, we need to know the true history of this country, not the white American version of this history, but the true history of this country. And the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what I want to bring to this table, is the perspective of having grown up in neighborhoods and have been part of my education is everything I've ever learned about the true history of this country, whether I lived in New York or whether I lived in Washington, D.C. The education I received from my friends who lived in Chocolate City when it really was Chocolate City. I probably learned more about the Black Power movement, the fight for social justice movement in those years in Washington, D.C. than any other time in my life. So what I bring to this I think, is that perspective and experience, but also I'm half Puerto Rican, half Dominican. And we don't make out easy in this discussion either, even though some of my Puerto Rican friends like to think that, oh, what, we're okay, we're not racist, we're not. Yeah, right. That's why that colorism is a big problem, as you well know, among Latinos, and there's a reason for that. So that's what I think I bring to it. What I want to get out of it is just I'm learning so much in this book, and I think that there's so much more too. Because I think part of what we want to accomplish also is that there's a lot of citations in this book, and I would love for us to explore some of those citations as well.
Yeah. You know, one thing I like to tag on what you said, you opened up and saying it, people said you're not Black. And that's kind of sort of at the root of what this conversation is about, particularly given, you know, in the early days and continued really up into today, is that there was something called the one-drop rule. There were people who, for every intents and purposes, who looked, whatever that word you want to use, white, Caucasian, who were deemed to be Black, because somewhere in their background there was the taint, and that taint was made clearly. Any person that had any kind of ancestry of African origin was considered Black. So that, you know, that you aren't Black, that's not accurate. I mean, I don't mean to say that you're, you know, and first of all, race is a construct. It's wrong.
Well, that's
false.
That's actually part of the thing I was going to say next. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, race is a construct. Is a political phony conversation. It doesn't exist, but it does exist in practical terms for people to hang stuff on it to meet their own particular rationalization.
Nice.
So that's where I come down that.
Yeah, and some of that is discussed in the book. I'm a little further along than you are, but you know, particularly in this country, those categories were created as a tool to subjugate the people that were enslaved. I'm going to just, for a second, I want to just share the front page of the 1619 project that was originally, before it was a book, was a project of the New York Times. So, and one second, I just want to share the screen so we will see it. So this is it was in the New York Times magazine. And I love this opening. In August of 1619, a ship appeared on the horizon near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the English colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists, which I think is really important to say, to repeat here. And no aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. On the 400th anniversary of this fateful moment, it is finally time to tell our story truthfully. And then, of course, it goes on from there.
Just one thing to add to that. You know the name of the ship, right?
Yes, the Lion.
White Lion.
White Lion, thank you.
White Lion, which, I mean, you couldn't, if you wrote that as a novel, An editor would probably set out, say, I think that's a little too on the head. But maybe history is about being on the head.
Yeah. I just want to, before we get into our reactions, part of the reaction to anybody who's been been alive the last couple of years since this was first appeared. The reaction was swift.
Mm-hmm.
There was a backlash. I mean, there was a lot of support for this project in the beginning, and still is. But there was as she writes here, a small group of historians who publicly attempted to discredit the project by challenging his historical interpretations and pointing to what they said were historical errors. And I think one of the really interesting quotes comes from a Princeton historian, Alan C. Quelzo, I believe is how it's pronounced. And he denounced the project for treating slavery not as a blemish that the founders grudgingly tolerated, not as a regrettable chapter in the distant past, but as a living, breathing pattern upon which all American social life is based.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes on, there's some interesting quotes that follow. And what I found interesting about this is, because we've all heard this growing up, everybody. Yeah, it existed, but it wasn't as bad as it's made out to be. And it only was a little bit in a few states. And I mean, I've heard it all when it comes to the rationalizations. And I mean, I never was told how many presidents were slaveholders, presidents who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who was the first president, who wrote our Constitution. What was the number of people?
1,700 legislators in the
in Congress.
Country, in Congress owned slaves. That does not count the number of judges who ruled on enacting those laws. Supreme Court justices, let's start with that. So yeah, so they had a vested interest
in maintaining the system.
Of course.
But you don't hear that, you don't read that. And so I always find interesting that anybody who studied history knows that history is a living thing. You don't, you're always uncovering primary sources. You're always that add to the puzzle. And this idea that somehow slavery was a sort of incidental thing when you put it in the greater context of who started this country and the role slavery played before the founding of this country.
Mm-hmm. The comments, the criticisms that were leveled against this book fall in a couple categories. One of which is, of course, historians that were finding fault with some of the facts that they said need to be revised. And that's acceptable because you said history is a living document and you're currently finding out new things. But there's another category that came out. And this is the one that really summed up a lot of the unfounded criticism. And I think it's by the same historian as you mentioned before, this Princeton historian, Alan C. Quelzo. And he said, yes, slavery was not a blemish. Slavery is not as a blemish that the founding fathers grudgingly tolerated. And he goes on to say that the source of his antipathy was not just what the project was saying, but who was saying it. Quote, It is the bitterest of irony that the 1619 project dispenses this malediction from the chair of ultimate cultural privilege in America, because in no human society has an enslaved people suddenly found itself vaulted in positions of such privilege, and with the consent, even the appropriation of those who were once the enslavers. And so he's concerned.
How do you translate that?
Well, I know what he's saying. He's saying, how dare you? You got an education. You went to an Ivy League school. You're at the citadel of journalism. You are here. You're in this place where culture is critiqued. And how dare you critique this country? You have no right to. That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
And to me, that sums up a certain segment of this country's beliefs, that you as a Black person, or you as a brown person, or you as a yellow person have no right to criticize the white establishment. And I take umbrage at that, as obviously the writers of this book.
So you've gotten what, you're on chapter 1, 2?
I am now at the middle of democracy, which is on page 25.
So, and of course, that doesn't include what we're going to talk about in a little bit, the preface, which is called Origins. So what's your reaction so far?
Well, two reactions. Personally, I'm getting the nuances of this thing going, like, wow, some of it I knew.
Yeah.
But the other part, and part of this too, is this. I have for a long time thought we should not be talking about slavery as a social ill. I mean, yes, it was, and it was a human rights issue. That to me is understood, but that doesn't get us to what slavery really was, which is an economical system. And the reason why I think that's important is because you're talking about reparation. Reparations are about finances. Reparations about economics. And it's clear that slavery was the economic engine that drove a lot of this country's prosperity. And one of the things that I was struck by, what Thomas Jefferson said, and it's a quote, and it's like, this says it pretty damn clearly about its economical feasibility of slavery. He said that, Jefferson calculated that a woman who brings a child every 2 years is more profitable than the best man on a farm. What she produces is an addition to capital, while the man's labor disappears as mere consumption.
Right.
That is truly economics 101. And to me, if you use that as a way to arrive at reparations, you can come to a number. I mean, we in this country talk about when you've been harmed, you can go to civil court.
Right.
And you can find out what the damages were, and you have economists do that. The same thing should be true of reparations. It's not difficult to find out how much slaves contributed, the damage that was done to slaves. And I'm not talking psychologically now, I'm just talking about economics.
Yeah.
And if you took this to, for example, let's say you could take it to a world court, and you put the issue of slavery in the United States before the world court, that would be one of the things I think you would be able to say is, what were the economic damages? And you could arrive at that.
Yeah. And that's a whole other discussion that we'll need to have at some point, talking about the whole issue of reparations and my personal belief that it'll never happen in this country, because a lot of what we talk about and what's discussed in this book is, as long as we're a white European dominated country, and we're going to go through a very dark period of, conservatives, political conservatives controlling this country. And it sort of goes to my reactions to what I've read. And I'm a little further along. I'm on page 117, and I'm in the chapter dealing with fear, and this is relevant to this discussion, because it just crystallizes um, to this day, the whole issue of why Black people in this country, but this applies to Latinos also, particularly dark Latinos or any dark person of color, is, and I hate to use this word, but I have to use this word because it's in the white European culture, the idea of the boogeyman.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The idea that when a white person robs a bank or commits some heinous crime like um, God, what do you call it? Any kind of spectacular crime. Nobody suddenly says every white person is responsible for that crime. And that we then suddenly say all white men are bank robbers or, serial killers, which, by the way, almost 95% of them are white men. And yet, if a Black person in this country commits a crime, all of a sudden it's like, they're the representative of an entire group of people. And so fear kind of deals with that issue of the origins of it and how it continues to this day to justify everything from our law enforcement policies to the legal system to the prison system, pretty much almost everything if you stop and think about it. So my reaction to this book is it crystallizes, I think you use that word, it crystallizes things that I already knew. It gets into some nuances that just like I go, oh man, I didn't make that connection. And I find that just so, it makes me want to really seriously figure out how this is going to play into my future education.
Well, I am an optimist. And you and I have discussed this often. My optimism to your pessimism.
I like to call it realism.
Okay, realism. And my unrealism. But I would say I am optimistic that this book and others like it that are out there are reframing the question.
Yes.
Agree. Because one of the things that she points out is that most of the information in this book was known in the academic circles.
Yes.
It didn't filter down to high school, for example, high school history class. You don't get this. I mean, in some high school history books, they're workers. They're not slaves.
Yeah.
It's like, okay,
I know.
These workers were transported over from the continent of Africa, and they were treated quite well.
I heard they booked passage.
Yeah, and they were treated quite well when they arrived.
Because the jobs were here.
Yeah, jobs were here. I mean, and we're being facetious. However, that is what some people really believe. If you really ask them those questions, slavery wasn't that bad. In fact, for many people, slavery was, a good thing. So
where would they be without the plantation to live on?
Exactly, and that's a sentiment that some white people have, and for the matter, some Black people have it too. I know some, but this book, among others, is reframing that. And I am one of those people that believes knowledge, while it may take a long time, knowledge has a way of changing our perceptions, changing our actions. And I do believe there will be reparations. Now, the question may be, what kind of reparations? But reparations have taken place in this country prior to this.
Yeah.
It took place with Native Americans. They did get reparations in the form of land. They did get reparations in terms of self-government. They got reparations in terms of casinos. Japanese Americans who were in prison, during World War II, did
concentration camps.
Yeah, concentration camp. Let's call it. They did get reparations. And reparations are worldwide. I mean, of course, we have the Jews in Israel, that is an example. So I do believe reparations will take place. Now, the question will be how they will be structured. And the fact that it is part of the conversations now, because 10 years ago, if you said reparations for Blacks, man, you would have been screamed at, not screamed at, you would have been hung out. And now it is part of the conversation. So I do believe it will at some point, I don't know when, will happen. But it takes books like this, it takes the knowledge to come for us to reach that point.
I want to read a note about this book that the editors wrote, and the Langston Hughes poem that follows it. One of the things that I loved about this, again, I'm obviously still reading it, this book does not sugarcoat anything. I love you brought that word up, reframing some things, because the things that we've heard about enslaved people over the years, described as indentured servants or tenant farmers or sharecroppers, some of which were true as sharecroppers after slavery ended, but we can have a whole conversation what that meant in reality. And the other, so let me just read this and we can talk a little bit more about it. This book uses a variety of terms to describe aspects of the era of slavery. In almost every case, the editors have avoided the word slave, quote unquote, to describe persons held in bondage. The alternate term, enslaved person, quote unquote, using the EN at the beginning of the slaved, accurately conveys the condition without stripping the individual of his or her humanity. In some instances, where it does not refer to a person, for example, slave state, and in some of the historical poetry and fiction, slave does appear. The editors have also attempted to limit the use of the terms that are sometimes used euphemistically, such as plantation or master, or to substitute when possible other terms that more accurately convey the historical situation of enslavement. And what I loved about it is at some point in one of the early chapters, she uses the word forced labor camps.
Yes.
Which is what they were.
That's better description.
And what hits me about this is when we talk about not sugarcoating it, is that growing up in the way we were taught American history and the mythology that surrounded that version of American history, sugarcoating not just enslavement, but everything else that kind of came out of it. Even the Civil War was sugarcoated in terms of it was, depending on your point of view, if you were in the South, taught, this was about states' rights and about, patriotism and loyalty to the South, and in the North, it was, about freeing the slaves. But in reality, we all know it was much more complicated in the North than just freeing the slaves. I just thought that this note was really important because it really does set up what comes.
Yeah, it's there's, as we've discussed, there's this whole myth, the myth of America, the myth of the founding fathers. And I wouldn't even say it's so much sugarcoating as much as it's about making a myth. And every nation does. I mean, we're no exception to that. I mean, we have a myth that you came to this country and you put down your stake and you made something yourself. What we leave out of that myth are the Native Americans who were here first, who were killed in genocide. It's, however you defined it, it's genocide. And every definition I've ever read about genocide applies to what happened to Native Americans.
Right.
Okay, so that starts off with that, the taking of that land. And then you have people that have to come over and that you have working on that land. And that was called slavery. And it's no other way of getting around it. and that slavery was the footing for the enterprise called capitalism in this country.
Yep.
And I don't see any way you can get around that. So what this book does, and I think others have done it, but this one has got entered into the popularization, because all those other books that mainly did this were academic.
Right.
This is more widely circulated, which is why I think this is going to be more powerful.
Yeah. And I love the fact that they use, besides this presentation of history, an interpretation of history as well, essays, but there's also poetry in this. There's some other things dealing with sort of more creative presentations. There's these she starts, the editors, but it's principally, it's created by Nicole Hannah-Jones,
Right.
and there's obviously other editors that were involved in this. But at the beginning of a lot of chapters, or most chapters, she'll start off with something like, I'll give you an example. There's a date, September 18th, 1850, Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act, and it's just a little paragraph explaining something significant that was part of, of this. And I think that adds, it's just, this is not a small book by any stretch of the imagination. How much was it? Because there's a lot of
600. I think it's 613 pages.
The
right?
actual content per se is 480 pages.
Yes.
But there's another almost 100 and something pages where there is literally citations for each chapter, because I'm sure that they knew that there was going to be, well, where did you get that from?
Serious backlash or that, yes.
Backlash,
yes.
And that's what they did.
And many of these people were historians that wrote this, so that's what they do.
Yes.
They footnote everything.
Right.
I've just barely passed Preface and gotten into this first chapter, Democracy. But one of the things that I like, and you touched on it, and she doesn't just talk about the fact of slavery, how it impacted the country. And in personal terms, there's a cultural aspect to this. And that's something that I have really want to see more dwelt on in other books. And I think she's going to touch on that. We used, and I say we as a country, used the culture of those Africans who came here to basically export American culture to the rest of the world. And if you think about American culture, so much of what we say as American culture has been based on African American culture, which started off in those communities that were considered, for lack of a better word now, ghettos, was, and I'm being facetious here to some degree, whitewashed, and particularly prior to the 60s, whitewashed and put through the ringer of Americanization and then sold to the rest of the world.
Right. Well, rock and roll is a great example.
Yeah, rock and roll, and particularly, if I can name you a lot of other culture.
Right.
Like the language itself.
Yes.
The language itself, the most obvious one is jazz. But I can name you all kinds of idioms of a language which has been left this country, and many people may not realize where it started. So we've been exporting culture, and that's a very powerful tool. As they call it, the soft power. The soft American power often has its basis in African American roots. Right. And one of the things that I see her starting to do is pointing that out. And I think that's, you have to look at the totality of this whole experience. So I'm really excited about getting further into the book.
Let me read this Langston Hughes poem, and then what I'd like to suggest is that we end this first show, and then next week we come back and talk about the preface and the origins.
Yes.
Because we could spend at least 2 shows on that. So there's a poem that is just before the preface, which is an essay written by Nicole Hannah-Jones called
Mm-hmm.
Origins. And she's not just talking about the origins of the book. I mean, she's talking a lot about the origins um, of the whole institution of slavery in this country. And this is Langston Hughes. It's from a I believe it's a larger poem, American Heartbreak, 1619. I am the American heartbreak, the rock on which freedom stumped its toe, the great mistake that Jamestown made long ago.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point. And here's a thought exercise for you and anyone else that's listening to this program or watching it. Imagine this country, United States of America, without African Americans and the slaves. I mean, just take a thought exercise and put forth that. What would this country look like? What would it be? Would we be the world power we are today? I mean, would we have the economic system we have today? Think about that. And I also, for those Native Americans who are also watching this program, I don't want to leave them out of the equation because, of course, it starts there. But I'm just saying, if you take away, the contributions that African Americans made to this country, what would it look like? And it's one that I can't even fathom what the country would look like if it were not for those people who came here in the hulls of ships, laid out in hulls of ships. What would the country look like?
Yeah, except that the reality is that it did happen.
No, it didn't. And yeah.
And I think that's, and the other part to this too is, and I want to get into this later on, is because I think it's so important, is both in terms of people from the Caribbean, slavery that enslaved people, Africans who came to the Caribbean, to Latin America,
yes.
Mexico, which often, I mean, denies that Africans are there. And you go, yeah, but I see that some people look a little dark there. Brazil was the largest recipient of African slaves.
Sure.
And a lot of intermarriage that's happened. So there's been some dilution. But, and this is again a mistake that a lot of people make, and we sort of touched on it at the very beginning, which is, for some generations, there's been so much dilution because so much intermarriage, whether with white European descendants or Indian descendants, that, they're not, you look at some and you go, well, they're not Black, but wait a second, hold on. But they suddenly, because this is I love about ancestry, and I'm going to do my own analysis. Things like ancestry. You suddenly you look at your roots, and you go, "Wait a second! There's a great grandfather out there who came from Africa."
What's interesting? That question, because some countries, and one of whom was Argentina. If you go to Argentina, you will see very few, quote unquote, Blacks, and they exist, but they're very few. One of the ways that Argentina basically used their policies against, and I couldn't say against Blacks, but they used this policy, they encouraged interracial groupings.
Yeah.
And because their thing
dilution.
They wanted to sort of wipe out that Black strain. And it's really fascinating to see how it worked in particularly that country. Other countries in Latin America, did something to it. Brazil's another one. although in Brazil it's probably more caste oriented.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in Argentina, they basically pretty much
Yeah.
diluted that black strain out of existence.
Well, it's still there. All right. So great start to our first show talking about the 1619 Project, the book. And next week, let's start off with a discussion about the preface called Origins.
Origins,
and we'll kind of go from there.
Excellent.
Thank you, sir. Good discussion.
Thank you for putting this together.